A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. You know, Herman, I was looking at my credit card statement this morning. Don't worry, I'm not asking for a loan, and I realized how much of our lives are governed by these tiny, invisible micro-decisions. Do I buy the fancy coffee? Do I click order on those noise-canceling headphones? Multiply that by 9 million people, and you have an economy. But what happens when a whole nation just stops clicking order?
That is the trillion shekel question, Corn. Or, more accurately, the $57 billion question, which is roughly where the cumulative GDP loss for Israel stands as we sit here in late March 2026. Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that, the hidden grinding cost of what he calls semi-hibernation. We talk about the missiles and the interceptions all the time, but the real silent killer of a national economy isn't the explosion, it's the silence in the shopping malls and the empty office chairs in the high-tech hubs.
It's the war tax. Nobody voted for, but everyone is paying. By the way, before we dive into the deep end of the Ledger of Doom, fun fact, Google Gemini. 3Flash is writing our script today. Hopefully it's better at math than I am, because some of these numbers Daniel sent over are staggering. We're looking at an 8.6% hit to annual GDP since October 2023. To put that in perspective for the folks at home, that's not a recession. That's a structural shift.
It really is. I'm Herman Poppleberry, and I've been obsessing over these fiscal reports all week. When we look at the cost of war, the human mind naturally goes to the kinetic stuff. We think about the cost of an Arrow 3 interceptor versus an Iranian ballistic missile. We've discussed that cost asymmetry before, how it costs more to defend than to attack. But the economic asymmetry Daniel is pointing to is actually much more terrifying. It's the cost of a mobilized high-tech society trying to function while the sword of Damocles is hanging over its head.
Right, because if you're a guy in a basement in a proxy militia, your operating costs are basically a bowl of rice and an old AK-47. But if you're a software engineer in Tel Aviv who is also a tank commander in the reserves, your absence from the economy costs the state thousands of dollars every single day in lost productivity, lost tax revenue, and lost innovation.
Think about the opportunity cost there. If that engineer is sitting in a tank in the north, he's not just not working. He's not solving the bug that would have allowed a fintech startup to scale to 10 million users. He's not sitting in the meeting that secures the next $20 million Series B funding round. The loss isn't just his hourly wage, it's the compound interest of his creativity.
And that's the brain drain effect. High-tech accounts for 18% of Israel's GDP and a massive 50% of its exports. When you pull those people out of their labs and put them in uniform, or even if they stay at home because the schools are closed and they're looking after their kids during a red alert, the engine of the economy just starts to sputter. It doesn't die, but it loses its timing.
But how does that work in practice for the companies themselves? I mean, do they just put projects on hold, or do they start looking at moving those roles to offices in Cyprus or Greece?
That's a great question. We're seeing a bit of both. Some firms are ghosting their own growth plans, but the real danger is the quiet relocation. A company doesn't announce it's leaving Israel. It just decides that its next 50 hires will be in Lisbon instead of Herzliya. It's a slow leak, not a burst pipe. It's like trying to run a Ferrari on kerosene. It might move, but you're ruining the engine. Daniel mentioned this semi-hibernation state. During the strikes back in February, consumer spending in non-essential sectors dropped by 15 to 20%. That's huge. That's the difference between a business staying afloat and a business folding.
And it's not just the immediate drop. Economists call it economic scarring. There's a fascinating, if depressing, body of research from the Center for Economic Policy Research and the IMF about this. They have this 10-year rule. Basically, countries that go through major, prolonged conflicts don't just bounce back once the shooting stops. They often see a persistent decline in output and trade that never recovers to the pre-war trend line. There is no evidence of a full recovery even a decade later in many cases.
So it's not a V-shaped recovery like we saw after the Second Lebanon War in 2006. I remember that. It was 34 days. It was intense. It cost about 0.5% of GDP. But then everyone went back to work, and the economy zoomed.
The 2006 conflict was a sprint. Operation Protective Edge in 2014 was a brisk jog. This is a marathon through a minefield. We are moving from a V-shaped recovery to what Daniel described as an L-shaped or staircase impact. Every time there's a new escalation, like the direct strikes with Iran we saw a few weeks ago, the economy doesn't just pause, it steps down to a new, lower baseline. We aren't climbing back up the stairs, we're just finding lower floors to live on.
That's a grim image, Herman. The staircase to the basement. But let's look at the actual mechanics of why this happens. If I'm an investor in New York or London, and I see a country that is indefinitely in semi-hibernation, why would I put my money there? The risk premium must be through the roof.
It is. Think about the credit default swap spreads. When investors get nervous about a country's ability to pay its bills or maintain stability, the cost to insure that country's debt goes up. For Israel, those spreads have widened significantly. The IMF notes that for every dollar spent on defense in these repeat conflict scenarios, about $1.50 to $2 of private investment is crowded out. Essentially, the government is sucking up all the available capital to pay for interceptors and reserve duty pay, leaving nothing for the startups or the infrastructure projects that actually grow the economy.
Wait, so the government is essentially competing with its own private sector for the same pool of money?
Precisely. If the state offers a high interest rate on a war bond to cover the deficit, why would a local bank lend money to a risky new AI startup? They'd rather take the guaranteed return from the government. So the very thing keeping the country safe, the defense budget, is starving the thing that makes the country wealthy.
And let's talk about the sectors that aren't high-tech. Daniel brought up construction and agriculture. Those are the ground level of any economy. If you can't build houses because you've lost your labor force, either because Palestinian permits were revoked or foreign workers left, you're creating a massive housing bubble for the future. You're essentially freezing the country's physical growth.
The housing starts have basically hit a wall. In agriculture, we've seen crops rotting in the fields. These are the unseen losses. When people look at the $57 billion loss, they see a big number, but they don't see the individual farmer who lost his entire year's income because he couldn't get pickers into the fields near the border. Or the young couple whose apartment won't be finished for another 3 years because the construction site is a ghost town.
I read a report about the dairy farms near the northern border. They can't just pause a cow. You have to milk them. You have to feed them. But if the area is a closed military zone, the logistics become a nightmare. It's the asymmetry of annoyance, turning into an asymmetry of existence. I want to go back to the global context for a second. Is Israel unique here? I mean, we're a small country, highly integrated into the global market. Does the scarring effect hit us harder than, say, a larger, more agrarian economy?
In many ways, yes. The IMF actually has data showing that Middle Eastern countries suffer deeper scars than other regions. A single year of severe conflict in this region can result in a permanent 2% loss in real GDP per capita. Now, Israel is an outlier because its economy is so advanced, but that advancement is actually a vulnerability in this specific context. Innovation requires a headspace. It requires a sense of stability. You can't invent the next breakthrough in AI or biotech if you're constantly checking the Homefront command app or wondering if your lead developer is going to be called up for another 60 days of reserve duty.
It's the innovation tax. If you're a global company like Intel or Google, and you have big R&D centers in Haifa or Tel Aviv, you start asking, can I rely on this office to deliver on a deadline if there's a chance 20% of the staff will vanish tomorrow? Even if the work gets done, the perception of instability is a poison.
And we're seeing that in the debt to GDP ratio. It was a very healthy 61% in 2023. Now, we're pushing 70%. The budget deficit is hovering around 6 or 7%, which is way above the government's target. This means the state is borrowing more, which means higher interest payments, which means less money for schools, hospitals, and, well, everything else.
But how much of that is just one-time spending? If the war ends tomorrow, doesn't that deficit just shrink back down?
You'd think so, but war spending has a way of becoming permanent spending. You have to replenish the stockpiles. You have to pay for the long-term rehabilitation of thousands of wounded soldiers. You have to increase the permanent size of the standing army because the threat environment has changed. The peace dividend we enjoyed for the last 20 years is effectively gone. We're moving into a permanent war economy footing.
It's the classic guns versus butter debate, but on steroids. And now we have the Iran escalation from February and March, adding a whole new layer, global energy disruption, the Strait of Hormuz situation. How does that feed back into the Israeli economy?
It's a double whammy. When oil prices spike because of tensions in the Persian Gulf, the cost of everything Israel imports goes up. Shipping costs rise. Insurance premiums for cargo ships heading to the eastern Mediterranean skyrocket. So even if there isn't a single drone launched at Tel Aviv, the cost of living in Israel rises because of the geopolitical instability. It fuels domestic inflation at the exact moment the economy is slowing down. That's the stagflation monster peeking out from under the bed.
So, we're in a situation where the hibernation isn't a choice. It's a forced state. But Daniel's question is, how long can a country afford this? Is there a breaking point, or can a modern high-tech state just grind along at three-quarters speed forever?
No country can afford it indefinitely. History shows that eventually the scarring becomes so deep that you lose your competitive edge. People, especially the high-tech elite who are hypermobile, start looking for the exits. If the quality of life to risk ratio gets too skewed, you lose the very people who power that 18% of GDP.
The brain drain isn't just about people leaving. It's about the people who don't come. The foreign experts who decide not to take that job in Rehovot. The venture capitalists who decide to fund a startup in Berlin instead of Herzliya because the geopolitical overhead is too high.
That's the crowding out effect in action. And it's why this semi-hibernation is so dangerous. It's a slow motion erosion. It's not a sudden collapse. It's like a house with termites. From the outside, it looks fine. The interceptors are working, the lights are on. But the structural integrity is being eaten away by these billions of dollars in lost productivity and diverted investment.
So what's the counterplay? If you're the Bank of Israel or the Ministry of Finance, how do you fight hibernation when you can't control the external threats?
You have to find a way to decouple the economy from the conflict as much as possible. This means more automation in construction and agriculture to reduce reliance on vulnerable labor. It means creating resilient work structures for high tech that can survive reserve call-ups. But honestly, Corn, there's no magic wand. You can't policy your way out of an 8.6% GDP loss. You can only manage the decline and hope for a strategic shift that allows the hibernation to end.
It's a sobering thought. We're essentially watching a live experiment in economic endurance. How much can a modern society take before the staircase leads to a floor we can't live on?
And the scary thing is, we don't know where the bottom is. We're in uncharted territory. No advanced economy has ever tried to sustain this level of mobilization and semi-hibernation for this long in the modern era. Think about the tourism sector. That's another thin section of the ledger. In 2019, tourism was huge. Now, it's basically just journalists and diplomatic delegations. The average tourist from Ohio or Leon isn't coming to a country in semi-hibernation.
That's a whole ecosystem of tour guides, hotel cleaners, and souvenir shop owners who are just waiting for years.
And the skills fade. The hotels fall into disrepair. The longer the hibernation, the harder the re-entry into the global market becomes. You lose your slot in the global traveler's mind.
Well, on that cheerful note, let's take a look at some of the more granular numbers Daniel pointed out. He mentioned the 8.6% tax. If you break that down, it's about 17,000 shekels per person in Israel. That's not just a number on a spreadsheet. That's money that isn't being spent on vacations, or home renovations, or new cars.
That's the consumer spending drop. When people are worried about the future, they save, they hunker down. This precautionary saving is great for individual stability, but it's a disaster for a consumer-driven economy. If everyone stops going to restaurants and cinemas, those businesses die. And those are the businesses that employ the people who aren't high-tech geniuses. It hits the middle and lower class the hardest.
It's the economic front line. The waitress in Haifa is just as much a casualty of this hibernation as the soldier on the border, just in a different way. Her wound is a zero-balance bank account and a close sign on the door.
And that brings us back to the global scarring data. The countries that see the most permanent damage are the ones where the social fabric of the economy, the small businesses, the service sector, gets torn apart. High-tech can often pivot or work remotely. A restaurant can't. A construction site can't.
But couldn't the government just subsidize those small businesses? We saw that during COVID, right? The furlough programs and the grants?
They can, and they have. But COVID was a global pause with a clear end once the vaccines arrived. This is a local, protracted drain. The government's pockets aren't bottomless. During COVID, the debt to GDP was rising everywhere. Now, Israel is an outlier. You can't print money forever to keep every coffee shop in Tel Aviv open if the customers aren't coming back for 3 years.
So, the hibernation creates a two-tier economy. Those who can wait it out, and those who get frozen out.
And the longer it lasts, the harder it is to thaw those frozen sectors. You can't just flip a switch and have 1,000 skilled construction workers reappear. Once they leave the industry or the country, they're gone.
It's a fascinating, if terrifying, look at the hidden war. We spend so much time looking at the sky for missiles, we forget to look at the ground at the slowing gears of the economy.
It's the ultimate test of national resilience. It's not just about how many missiles you can shoot down, it's about how many economic hits you can take and still keep the lights on for the next generation.
Well, Herman, you've managed to make me feel even worse about my credit card statement, but I think it's a necessary perspective. We have to understand the full cost of the long war, not just the part that makes the evening news. By the way, I saw a stat that said the average Israeli household has increased its emergency fund by 40% since 2023.
That's the hibernation in a nutshell. That 40% isn't being invested in the stock market or spent at the mall, it's sitting under a proverbial mattress. It's dead money from a macro perspective.
Let's look at the global comparisons Daniel mentioned. He pointed to the CEPR research on persistent declines in output. Are there any success stories? Any countries that have faced this kind of repeat conflict and managed to avoid the 10-year scar?
Success is a relative term here. Some countries have managed to stabilize at a lower level, but very few have returned to their original growth trajectory as long as the threat of conflict remained. South Korea is the one people often point to. They've lived under a threat for 70 years and still became an industrial powerhouse. But the threat there has been largely static, not an active multi-front war with periodic direct strikes from a regional power like Iran.
So the hibernation isn't the problem. It's the lack of springtime. We're stuck in a perpetual late autumn.
That's a very poetic way of putting it, Corn. A bit too poetic for the Bank of Israel, maybe, but it fits. We are waiting for a spring that keeps getting delayed by another cold snap. And every cold snap kills off a few more seedlings, the new startups that never got founded because the founders were in Gaza or on the Lebanese border.
I wonder if we'll see a shift in where the innovation happens. Maybe the defense tech sector becomes the only game in town? If that's where the government is spending the money, that's where the talent will go.
That's already happening. Dual-use technology is the new buzzword. If you can invent a sensor that works for a missile but also for a self-driving car, you're in business. But that's a narrow slice of the economy. You can't build a whole nation on sensors and interceptors. You need the boring stuff too. The retail, the tourism, the education.
Well, let's hope the economic meteorologists are wrong, and we see a thaw sooner than later. But in the meantime, we have to deal with the war tax and the hibernation as part of the new reality.
It's the new normal. As much as I hate that phrase, it's about adaptation. How does a nation stay innovative while under siege? How do you keep a startup nation mentality when the startup is just trying to survive the next quarter?
Maybe the innovation will come from the crisis itself. New ways of working, new ways of building, new ways of defending that don't bankrupt the state.
That would be the Israeli way, wouldn't it? Turning a vulnerability into a strength. But man, the price tag is getting steep.
It really is. 57 billion and counting. And that's just the direct GDP loss. What about the indirect stuff? The mental health costs, the educational gaps for kids who miss school.
Those are the long-term liabilities. You don't see them on the 2026 balance sheet, but you'll see them in the productivity numbers of 2040. A kid who misses 6 months of math because of rocket fire is a less productive engineer 20 years from now. That's the deepest scar of all.
It's the compound interest of trauma.
Let's save the rest of that for the next time we want to be thoroughly depressed. For now, I think we've given the listeners plenty to chew on. The asymmetry isn't just in the weapons, it's in the very foundation of the economy.
Or, as I should say, since I'm not a donkey, I completely agree.
Hey, I resemble that remark.
Anyway, let's wrap this up before I start making more animal puns.
Good idea. Big thanks to our producer Helbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning even when we're in semi-hibernation.
And a huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and keep our AI scriptwriter fed and watered.
If you're finding these deep dives valuable, the best way to support us is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It really does help other people find the show.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I'm Herman Poppleberry.
And I'm Corn. Stay curious, stay resilient, and maybe check your credit card statement once in a while.
Goodbye, everyone.
See ya. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth.